Well, good morning and welcome to the launch of the Japan Chair Program at the IISS. This program was begun in late 2019 and was to be launched formally in early 2020, but then COVID intervened, and it is really only now that we can gather people together in London to mark and celebrate its considerable achievements and its future goals. The chair was established in mid-2019 and announced by us in Tokyo after the government of Japan had made a generous capital donation of $8 million to the IISS to establish the position which is held by Robert Ward. He is a fluent Japanese speaker who lived in Japan near the start of his career and followed closely its politics and economics for some 20 years at the Economist Intelligence Unit, or EIU as it's better known. We are delighted to have had Yuka Koshino, affiliated to the Japan Chair Program from its start, and this year we have welcomed another dynamic Japanese analyst, Mariko Togashi, to work also within the program. We're fortunate, too, that the chair of the Board of Trustees of the IISS is a long-standing Japan watcher and analyst, and is also the chair of the Japan Society in the UK, which is having its dinner tonight. When we rescheduled this launch, we could not imagine that it would take place the day of the funeral of Abe Shinzo, the former Prime Minister of Japan and a global statesman. His assassination last week was shocking and a loss to Japan and to the world. I would ask all who are in this room to please stand for a minute's silence in his memory and in respect. Thank you. The IISS has had a very long relationship with Japan. There have, since the 1970s, always been Japanese members of our advisory council, sometimes as many as 3. A major annual conference was run by the IISS in Kyoto in the 1980s, and for 2 decades, leading diplomats from the Japanese Foreign Ministry, the Gaimusho, were seconded for a year's work at the Institute. Since 2002, Japan has every year sent its defense minister to the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue we organize in Singapore. In 2014, as we were just reminded by his image on the screen, Abe Shinzo delivered the keynote address, and just last month, Prime Minister Kishida did so again. He warned that Ukraine today might be East Asia tomorrow, and strengthened his call for a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Japan Chair Program at the IISS examines the geoeconomics and geopolitics of Japan in an international context and from an international perspective. Economic statecraft and national security strategy will be central, though not exclusive, themes. A Japan Memo podcast is a regular feature, and a splendid Adelphi book on economic statecraft has just been published. 2 of its authors are with us today. With the chair of the IISS, they'll now open a discussion offering some reflections on Japan, which we hope will animate some debate and advance our own thinking on how the IISS Japan Chair Program may best contribute to international debate. So with that, I might ask Bill Emmett, the chair of the Board of Trustees of the IISS, to kick us off today. Bill.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. It is, I think, as chair of the trustees of the IISS, I can say it's wonderful to have a Japan program launched these past 3 years, in a way at long last, thanks to the generous donation of the Japanese government, because Japan is playing such an important role in what we now call, thanks to Abe-san, the Indo-Pacific. And in particular, the book that Robert and Yuka have, in a way, launched the whole enterprise with intellectually about Japan's effectiveness as a geo-economic actor is also, I think, a very fitting way to begin this program intellectually. Why do I say fitting? Because I think the evolution of Japan during the time when I've had the privilege to be watching, covering, analyzing, trying to understand, make sense of Japan, has been principally a geo-economic evolution, which has now turned into a position of multi-dimensional security significance as an actor in the Indo-Pacific. My role this morning is, in a way, as the greybeard on the panel, someone who's been watching Japan for almost 40 years, I confess. And therefore, I start my reflections recognizing that Abe Shinzo's father, Abe Shintaro, was Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Nakasone government when I landed in Japan as the Economist correspondent way back then. And of course, this family, the Abe Kishi Sato family, have an extraordinary role in modern Japanese political history, from his grandfather, Prime Minister, his uncle, Sato Eisuke, Prime Minister, and his father, Abe Shintaro, Foreign Minister himself, Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister, his brother, the current Defense Minister of Japan. So it is an extraordinary family story. But also, I think, personally, reflecting on Japan's evolution, I think back to the time of Abe Shintaro as Foreign Minister. At that time, Japan's foreign policy, in the early to mid-1980s, this was, I think, would best be described as passive, somewhat on the back foot, obviously important as an economic power within Indo-Pacific. But Abe Shintaro's slogan, if one call it that, which was an omnidirectional foreign policy, I think tells you quite a lot about it, that it was a foreign policy that was intended to be friends with everyone, to offend no one, and to be somewhat reactive and passive at the time. Of course, in that era, in the 1980s, Japan was already an geo-economic actor, but thinking back to that time, the principal target of Japan's geo-economic policies and influence was not China, it wasn't Southeast Asia, it was the United States. It was the United States as this combined force of both closest security ally, absolute deep dependence in foreign policy terms, but also, in a way, economic adversary at that time. So the geo-economic thrust of Japanese policy was to try to manage, mitigate, soften economic hostility from the United States in order to serve the security interests of the time. The LDP in those days was also quite scratchy about the media. There's been quite a lot of what's been striking about Abe Shinzo in the media since his tragic assassination on Friday is how different, in some ways, the view of him outside Japan, which is more unalloyed sense of admiration for his foreign policy achievements, and rather, as with Margaret Thatcher, a much more divided view inside Japan, which one strand of which is all to do with his rather aggressive, slightly authoritarian approach to the media. But I think back to his father, and I remember being at a press event with his father, and a member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs coming over to me and my friend, another journalist, and ticking us off for the rather impertinent questions we asked. So I don't think that this is an absolutely new thing. But what is new, so if we compare, and I compare Abe Shintaro's time with Abe Shinzo and Japan today, is that forward posture that now Japan has in foreign policy and in geoeconomic policy. Of course, Japan was always active. I, at a certain point of my writing career, became, because I was writing about Japan, India, and China, I became something of a connoisseur of Chinese museums of the Sino-Japanese conflicts. And I remember going to one actually near Marco Polo Bridge, if I recall correctly, where the entire exhibit was about how terrible Japan was and how all the appalling things it had done. But then the final room was devoted to a thank you to Japan for all the aid, the loans and aid that had been coming for previous decades. So Japan was always then a geoeconomic actor. But in the last 10 to 20 years, Japan has become much more significant. And if one looks now at the institutions that were built during the Abe period and beyond, they give Japan, I think, a very forward position. Particularly, I focus on the unpronounceable, comprehensive and progressive or Trans-Pacific Partnership as being the great achievement of, in a way, Japanese geoeconomic diplomacy in recent years. Rescuing that, well, first of all, joining the negotiations once they had been initiated by the Obama administration, some degree sacrificing domestic agricultural interests in order to get into the negotiations, or using the negotiations to be able to reform agriculture, depending on your point of view. But then, once the Trump administration withdrew from that institution and that negotiation, rescuing it and setting it up as an 11-country entity, which other countries are now seeking to join, most notably the United Kingdom. So I think that that institution will be one of the enduring legacies of Abe Shinzo, but also symbolizes to me the forward posture that now Japan's foreign policy has in Indo-Pacific, and especially in the economic field. With that, I'm going to hand over to the actual experts, Robert Ward and Yuka Koshino, to take a more detailed look at today. Robert.
Thank you, Bill, for that tour de table of your 40 years looking at Japan. I went to Japan in 1989 as a sort of young thing, freshly graduated from university, to Japan that was at the time the future. It looked growing quickly. Bill and I, we both experienced the bubble, Japanese bubble of the 80s. And so the way I look at what's happened in Japan has a sort of 30-year span, and having gone very quiet in the 1990s and starting to stir in the 2000s, as Bill said, in the last sort of 10 years, Japan's role, well, regionally obviously, but also I think increasingly globally, has been transformed beyond recognition. And to a large extent, as we argue in the book, this I think owes much to Abe. Abe, of course, built on reforms that were undertaken in the 1990s, actually things that happened in the 80s, reforms that were undertaken in the 90s and the Koizumi period as well. But he really did, I think, transform Japan. So one factor is Abe. Another factor, I think, which Abe identified ahead of the curve was the rise of China, and why the rise of China was not necessarily just a benign phenomenon, why it also carried risk for Japan. I think we can see the activism that Abe initiated in his second administration, 2012 to 2020, in Tokyo's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Prime Minister Kishida Fumio gave a keynote speech at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, and I do recommend you listen to it, because one of the sort of takeaways for me was the commitment the Japanese government has to continued global activism. And it was striking in the speech just how quickly the Prime Minister moved to issues about Ukraine, issues about the global order, and so on. So very important speech. In our book on Japan's effectiveness as a geoeconomic actor, we analysed the drivers of this transformation over the past 30 or so years. But we focus on geoeconomic power, on Japan's geoeconomic power, a tool of statecraft that Japan has long possessed, but for many decades after the Second World War never really flexed as much as it could do. And we take a very sort of straightforward view of what geoeconomic power is, describing it as deploying economic instruments to secure foreign policy aims and to project power. Why does geoeconomic power matter to Japan? Well, as those of you that know Japan well will know, there are considerable constraints around its sort of full spectrum power projection capabilities, largely around the constitution, renouncing war, limits on the maintenance of war potential, and so on. But also, and again, I think this comes back to Abe's identification, Abe's strategic view rather, is that geoeconomic power is also an important means by which Japan seeks to balance China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. China's endlessly interesting, obviously, but one of the sort of distinguishing features about China, in my view, is that it projects power geoeconomically. China is a geoeconomic power. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is shifting to digital Silk Road, health care Silk Road, green Silk Road, and so on, all of which has a sort of geoeconomic underlining to it. So I think Japan's deployment of geoeconomic power is in part a recognition by Japan and particularly by Abe in the early days that dealing with China requires a different strategy. China is a revisionist power embedded in the global economy, unlike the USSR. And so I think Japan's contribution to the debate is trying to balance China through geoeconomics as well as through hard power. Given Japan's strategic importance in the region, and I think now, Japan has been described elsewhere as indispensable to the like-minded, which I think is absolutely right. Obviously, looking at the question of its effectiveness of its geoeconomic power projection is critical, particularly given the defence constraints that I've already noted. We also argue, I think this is a very important point in the book, that that what Japan is doing is also a sort of template for other middle powers. The middle powers have a sort of responsibility, in our view, for supporting international rule of law, an interest in preventing great powers from exerting their exceptionalism and their spheres of influence. So I think what Japan is doing is analytically interesting, strategically interesting, because it's conceptualizing economic statecraft explicitly within a geopolitical framework. In the book, we also look at Japan's journey to a geoeconomic actor. I'm not going to go into all the analysis that we present on the 1960s and 1970s or 1980s, interesting though it is. But if you look at the period since 1990, when you had the trauma of Japan's reaction to the first Gulf War, where it bankrolled a lot of the effort but didn't receive much credit because it didn't contribute blood to the conflict. If you look at the 1997 Asia crisis, for example, where Japan tried to support the tottering economies of East of Asia, but because of its own economic problems was unable to really make headway, whereas China was able to flex its geoeconomic muscle. And I think this is one of the first displays of this from China by not devaluing the renminbi. So the 1990s, a period of change, a period of reforms under the Hashimoto administration. But I don't think it's until the 2000s that we really see Japan starting to stir. Under the Koizumi administration, Japan's unprecedented response to the US war on terror, expanding the range of activity of the self-defense forces, Japan's military. And then we had in 2006-07 Abe Shinzo's first administration, which was interesting because we could see sort of things that Abe wanted to do, but his administration was too short to be effective. And then we had, after that, the upheavals of the DPJ in government, 2009 to 2012. In the book, we look at Abe's second administration in 2012-2020 as a structural break for Japan. And I think he is actually, trying to think over the last few days, I think he is, given the policy achievements that he had, I think he is probably Japan's most consequential post-war prime minister. I think he was one of the first as well to have a sort of through composed view of how to project Japan's role in the region by combining internal balancing and external balancing. So on internal balancing, we have the security changes that he initiated, the new Japan Defense Corporation guidelines, the controversial legislation in 2015, the institutional changes that Bill has mentioned, the National Security Council, which we argue is probably one of the most important institutional innovations in Japan since the Second World War, the first ever national security strategy document for Japan. And then, of course, we had Abenomics. Less successful in many respects, but I think one of the underrated achievements of Abenomics was to put Japan back on the map. As an EIU Japan analyst, it was a sort of lonely furrow that I was ploughing from 1997 to 2010. Our clients weren't really interested in Japan at all, unless they had a sort of legacy interest in the country. But it wasn't really until 2012 that we noticed in our clients at the EIU that clients were starting to be more interested in Japan. What are these three arrows? What is this unorthodox monetary policy, and so on? So I think that PR in Abenomics, I think, isn't to be underrated. And then the external balancing, so the free and open Indo-Pacific concept of 2016, sort of an ordering principle for Japanese economic statecraft, a sort of geo-economic thread running through that. The free and open Indo-Pacific concept now used in various forms by lots of other countries as well. I think that must be a first that Japan has actually given a name to a region and to a concept within the region. As Bill noted, the rebirth of the TPP as the CPTPP, don't have to say it out loud because you said it for me, which I'm grateful for, in 2018, which we think in the book was the biggest geoeconomic triumph of the Abe premiership. I always think, try and imagine the region now. Now we have the Chinese-dominated RCEP. Try and imagine that now without the balancing importance of the CPTPP. He also, I think one of these sort of key points that I made at the beginning is this is all driven by Abe's early identification of China's importance. And I think if you sit in Japan, you realize how close Japan is to China, and you realize just how quickly China has eclipsed the Japanese economy economically. And this, I think, is an important thing and another important driver behind what Mr. Abe did. Not that Abe got everything right, of course. His Russia policy was always controversial, even in his pomp. Now discredited, of course, because thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. His policy towards South Korea, we call this in the book, it was a geo-economic failure, and has obviously consequences for the stability of this unstable region. So there were some failures, but we think overall Abe's second administration was a structural break. Very briefly now to the conclusion, before I hand to Yuka, we don't think any return to Japan's low posture, so the sort of quietist Japan that we knew in the 60s to the 90s. We don't think you're going to get a revolutionary scenario in which we get sort of massive constitutional change, which will buttress Japan's geoeconomic power projection capabilities, despite the LDP's good result in the upper house election. More likely, we say, Japan will continue to project geoeconomic power, maintaining economic interoperability with the US where it can, and complementing its alliance relationship with the US. And with that, hand over to you, please.
Thank you, Robert. And first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And it's my great honor to be presenting our first Adelphi book research to you in person today after COVID. So Robert laid out why geoeconomic power matters for Japan to protect and reinforce the post-war rules-based order, and how Japan tried to pursue that. In my remarks, I would like to first lay out 4 factors that we have identified that could affect the implementation of Japan's geoeconomic strategy in the context of US-China strategic competition, and also like to end with a concluding thought. So first factor is that the outwardness of diplomatic posture. Tokyo cannot meet the challenges alone, not just Tokyo, but any countries, including the United States now. However, it often takes an inward approach on foreign policy issues, often driven by domestic political interests and its unique Shimaguni mentality as an insular country, as Japan's famous strategist Kosaka Masataka put it in 1965. In that sense, former Prime Minister Abe and his successors' pursuit of Japan's proactive and global diplomatic and security role is a new trend and is an outlier looking back to post-war history. But how sustainable is this trend going to be? Japan's enduring COVID-19 border restrictions on foreigners, for instance, could be raised as an example on how it could turn backwards from a free and open Japan after a crisis. The measure has contracted Japanese economy and limited people-to-people exchanges, which is critical for maintaining diplomatic ties, but also to maintain geoeconomic literacy or strategic literacy more broadly among policymakers, businesses, and the wider society. Sustainability of Japan's outwardness and openness would be a key for Tokyo to closely coordinate with its like-minded existing partnerships, but also to develop new partnerships with like-minded partners to tackle the complex geoeconomic challenges together. Second is the fragmentation within the policy-making community and the society itself. Tokyo's recent efforts to take a whole-of-government approach is a good step forward to tackling the complex geoeconomic challenges that Robert has laid out. Such an effort is now recognized as an innovative approach internationally, such as setting up a new economic division within the National Security Secretariat and a new economic security minister position to speed up the passage of the economic framework that Japan is trying to pursue. But however, the government-industry relations remains to be a major challenge for success. There's a lot of examples that we lay out in our book, but just taking a snapshot of today, industries are struggling to relocate its supply chain from China after the pandemic. Industries are also not convinced yet about government's R&D plans for critical technology in the realm, development in the realm of 5G, AI, and quantum technologies under the new economic security framework. Private sector is a main actor in the great game of geoeconomics that we describe in our book, and their alignment is essential for success. Coordination among all these actors is critical for the resilience of the geoeconomic strategy. This leads to the third factor, the ideological division, which have constrained Tokyo's effort to overcome some of the fragmentation issues that I've just laid out within the society to fully unleash its geoeconomic power, which is the technology dimension of this power. Critical and emerging technologies such as 5G, AI, quantum technologies, big data, robotics, data science, these are drivers for the current but future economy, but also essentially they are dual use and could be applied for military purposes. And that is the reason that why the technology dimension has become a focal point for the US-China major power competition. Harnessing innovation in these areas for Japan's economic competitiveness while protecting the outflow of such sensitive technology to its competitor requires closer coordination between the government, the defense and civilian sectors within the government, but also in the society more broadly. The anti-militarism culture that remains strong in the Japanese society, especially in the academic world, has, however, historically limited such interactions between the communities. Currently, for instance, Japan's defense ministers have no role in Japan's long-term science and technology innovation strategy policymaking, and the defense ministry also has a minimal role to play in that process. The number of academic institutions' participation in defense industries Defense Ministry's new National Security Technology Research Promotion Fund, which was established in 2015 to foster basic research development in the dual-use technologies that I've laid out, are sharply declining after the Science Council of Japan's pledge in 2017 that academic institutions, quote, will never be engaged in scientific research for military purposes. Such a fragmentation will challenge the government's ability, first, to prevent the outflow of sensitive technologies, as I mentioned, but second, to develop an integrated national science and technology strategy to harness innovation. And even thirdly, international science and technology cooperation with partners to further remain competitiveness in these technology areas. In the long term, we observe that this will have significant consequences, not just for Japan's technological and industrial competitiveness, but also its ability to shape the standards, rules, and norms in these new areas that have become a focal point, again, for the major power competition. The final power factor is the relationship with the United States, which is Japan's only treaty ally, the world's largest economic power, and also an important balancing power against the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific region. Alliance management will be key for Japan to protect and pursue its geoeconomic interests. But historically, the US has both catalyzed but also limited Japan's geoeconomic power. The US has helped improve Japan's geoeconomic literacy on important geoeconomic issues, such as joining TPP, as Bill mentioned, under the Obama administration, or understanding the security risk associated with using Chinese vendors, for instance, on its digital critical infrastructure, such as 5G. US has also spurred Japan to pursue a more ambitious carbon neutral goals to achieve the 2015 Paris Agreement. The America First unilateral approach under Trump administration and the US retreatment from CPTPP also urged Tokyo to fill in the regional and global leadership gap to maintain these rules-based order. The pursuit of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision to bring together the like-minded partners is a good example. In contrast, the trade friction, looking back history, the trade friction, for instance, throughout the 1980s and 1990s have urged Tokyo to restrain its semiconductor export to US or refrain from developing domestic fighter jet, for instance. These were consequential for Tokyo's to maintain its semiconductor manufacturing capabilities and also to maintain the defense industrial base. Unilateral sanctions against Chinese tech firms and export control measures under the Trump administrations continued by Biden administration, for instance, also pressured Japanese tech firms from using Chinese and US content as well. Under the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, the two countries are closely coordinating their approaches to counter China's, for instance, BRI or economic security issues, but the latter has the risk, for instance, returning inward and emphasizing the divergent approaches between the United States and Japan. So this brings to my final point. So what are the keys for Tokyo's geoeconomic effectiveness? So Japan's external environment is highly dynamic, which places a premium on Tokyo's ability to adjust its geoeconomic strategy so that it remains effective. We have identified three interlinked key areas for Japan to be effective as a geoeconomic actor. First is the economic health to project its geoeconomic power and to maintain resilience of its strategy. This requires the government's ability to coordinate with private sector to maintain the resilience of Japan's strategically important sectors for its economy, such as the automobile industries and semiconductors, and strategic technology areas. Second is Japan's continued investment in security posture to protect its geoeconomic interests, maritime security to support supply chain or cyber capability to protect its critical infrastructure from attack, or protecting space assets which has now become a critical dimension of the everyday economy, are several obvious examples that suggest the need for a stronger security backing for its geoeconomic strategy. And then the third that we emphasize is the improved military-civilian interaction to effectively maintain Japan's technological competitiveness, especially in the realm of digital space, which have become the focal point of US-China competition, Japan's future growth, and security. So these are the three interlinked areas that we lay out in the end when considering Japan's future geoeconomic effectiveness. And thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yuka, particularly in the beginning for mentioning the importance of strategic literacy, something which I hope this institute does its best to contribute to. And your reminder that civil-military relations are not just about individuals and institutions, but also key in developing that integrated defense industrial base on which Japan's future geoeconomic power might be formed. So we've got a lot of questions that we've raised, both through the book and generally. We have people online who might ask questions, but those of you in the room have first priority. So anyone who'd like to make a point or ask a question, I please invite you to seek my attention, and then I'll point you out. I think we'll go first to the Financial Times, John Paul Rathbone, and I've seen Dana and James, but if you can go ahead and just speak to the microphone that is immediately adjacent. Thank you.
Thank you. John Paul Rathbone, the Financial Times. Last week we had the head of the FBI and the head of the MI5 making an unprecedented joint statement about how China was a game-changing security threat, especially on industrial espionage. And I wondered, A, if there was any kind of sense of that similar sort of peril in Japan, and if it's broadcast in any way the same manner, and if there were any kind of examples of how this espionage is carried out, or the technology transfer best put, whether it's via supply chains or active spying or cyber attacks, any sense of that dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. Yuka, do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that's also, Japan is definitely stepping up in that area as well. A recent example would be, a specific example would be the attribution to a Chinese PLA-affiliated hacking group and an individual, a communist member individual for conducting espionage, cyber-enabled espionage against the space industries in Japan. This included not just the private sectors, but also the government institutions and space government agencies, institutions, research institutions. So this was, I think, the first time that the Japanese police agency attributed China for the first time, and Japan's cyber strategy also mentions that it's going to boost it's going to be more forward looking in terms of attributing China and also cooperation with international partners. So I think that's a trend that's going on in Japan as well. Thanks.
Bill and Robert? Yeah.
I would just add, do I need to press something?
Yeah.
Maybe I do, yep. I would just add two thoughts. One is that because Japan's private sector has been for such a long time such big investors in China, I think that the awareness and sensitivity to technological espionage and in particular technological transfer issues is very deep set and has been for quite a long time. It's certainly believed, I don't know about the evidence, that China's extraordinary high-speed train network benefited, shall we say, from a certain amount of commercial espionage, of technological espionage of Japanese train technology, for example. This has led to a pretty tough approach for a long time to technology transfer issues and joint venture type issues that have been only relatively more recently high level in other Western countries. Second point I'd observe is just about the future, which is that in the expansion of defense and security spending that is promised and pledged by Japan, investment in the intelligence system is likely to be a very large part of that, in my view, or at least an important part of it, even if it's not as expensive as building an aircraft carrier. But I mean, in other words, it's an important part of as it were, bringing up to date or making more realistic the defense and security posture.
And just a coda to Yuka's and
the microphone.
just as a coda to Yuka's and Bill's comments, in Kishida's first cabinet, he appointed an economic security minister, Kobayashi Takayuki, which was a first, I think a global first, to have this particular portfolio in the cabinet. And Kobayashi's job was to pilot the economic security legislation through the Diet, which that happened earlier this year. But the issues that you refer to are also sort of dealt with, or the government's trying to deal with these, partly through its economic security legislation. And two of the pillars of this, one is protection of critical infrastructure against attacks, various attacks, and the other is deals with patent non-disclosure. So you can see that the government is worried about sort of grey zone activity by China and others within Japan. And the government is now putting sort of meat on the bones, trying to operationalize this legislation over the next sort of year or so. And it'll be interesting to see just exactly how that pans out, because clearly there are issues around this for how industry operates within Japan as well, and sort of relations between industry and government.
Great, so let's move to 2 or 3 in a row. First, Dana Allen, then maybe James Landale afterwards, and then up to James Crabtree. But let's do 3 in a row, and then we'll come back. Dana?
Thank you. Thanks, John. Speaking as an American, Bill, you brought back memories of youth when you invoked the 1980s idea of a Japanese geoeconomic power and indeed threat. And I was just wondering, I mean, there were a lot of, if looking back, there were a lot of stupid manifestations of this anxiety. One of Sean Connery's lesser movies, I think Donald Trump actually started sort of chewing on international politics with alarmist Japan bashing at the time. And so I wonder, looking back on those days and that idea, I mean, it wasn't just these stupid manifestations. There was also maybe a more serious idea of a new paradigm of international geoeconomic power as opposed, for example, to failing Soviet military power at the time. What is left of that? I mean, what lessons are there from that earlier idea?
Thank you. James Landale, and if you just turn, Dana, if you just look, there we go. Thanks.
Thank you, James Landale, BBC. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Japan's view on how it sees itself as a member of the political, if not geographic, West. You mentioned, Robert, the idea of it being a template for other countries around the world. What does Japan think about the slightly Manichaean debate about democracies versus autocracies, or the debate about how the West should do more to engage with the so-called swing states, all of these debates that have been exacerbated and shaped by the conflict in Ukraine. So what is, I suppose the question is, how does Japan see its role as part of the West, qua West, in the broadest sense of it?
And if you could bring the microphone up to James Crabtree. Before James answers the question, I might just, a few short notes, James, to your point. Interesting that at the Shangri-La Dialogue, the Japanese speaking referred specifically to the NATO standard of 2% GDP expenditure. And of course, were Japan to get to 2% of GDP expenditure, it would catapult Japan into 3rd place of defense expenditure in the world after the US and China, leaving Germany, were it to keep to its 2% commitment and its 100 billion euro pledge, to 4th place. Who would have thought 2 years ago that Japan and Germany would respectively occupy 3rd and 4th places in the defense expenditure hierarchy, and that a Japanese politician would refer to a NATO standard as guiding its own defense expenditure policy. And equally, I think all the talks that Kono Taro made a couple of years ago about, could China sort of join the Five Eyes and be a Sixth Eye, and the current talk you hear about AUKUS +1 arrangements where Japan might, if they organize themselves in the way that Yuka recommends, contribute on the quantum technology, AI, and technology parts, I think indicate that there's at least an appetite in certain quarters of Tokyo to find it on those geopolitical and technological elements a stronger and tighter alignment by the West. I'm sorry I couldn't help myself there, but James Crabtree, go ahead.
I also wanted to follow up on James Landale's point about the template argument in the book, which Robert mentioned. So I'm based in Singapore. If you look around Asia, a lot of countries look at the Japanese example and think that they have achieved something remarkable. The combination of trade policy, infrastructure investment, other sorts of business links have allowed Japan to create a position for itself which is a 3rd pole in Asia, so aligned with the US but separate from it, particularly in Southeast Asia. Lots of very positive links. And so if you're Australia or the Republic of Korea, you look to Japan as an example. Even countries, I think, like the United Kingdom could could look to Japan. But I guess the question is, can these other countries do what Japan has done? So to put it sort of bluntly, they don't have the money that Japan has, they don't have the industrial companies that Japan has, and they normally don't have the patience that Japan has. So is Japan really a template? And if so, which bits of the Japan template, if you were Liz Truss or Penny
It's a
Wong,
long list.
could you take most easily and readily?
Let's go down the panel. So Robert first, then Bill, then Yuka.
So yes, very good questions actually. So Japan's view of how it sees itself as part of the West, or like-minded, or however one chooses to call it. One of the interesting things, I think you cited the autocracy versus democracy thing. One of the interesting things about Prime Minister Kishida's speech in the Guildhall a couple of months ago, he was talking about new capitalism, and one of the interesting things for me was how he cited new capitalism as an important thing within to protect democracies within this autocracy versus democracy fight, and to make democracy grow and be resilient and so on. Now, clearly, new capitalism, the contours, many of the contours have yet to be defined properly. And Bill and I have been talking about how the labour market reform is an issue that hasn't been tackled yet in new capitalism. But I think you can see there, I think this is the first time that I can think of a Japanese Prime Minister conceptualising domestic policy within a sort of global geopolitical framework. So I think that's interesting. Another point which I think also touches on James's question is, I think one of the interesting things about Japanese policy, particularly under Abe, and Abe 2.0, was this sort of effort to balance in Asia. So to prevent bandwagoning by smaller states, and that's important because China's so economically dominant in Asia. So the free and open Indo-Pacific concept that I mentioned, that is open in theory to China if it signs up to to the principles and so on. So Japan is sort of conscious of its position as a leading economic power in Asia, among the like-minded in Asia. It's conscious that it's trying to sort of tread this middle way between sort of Charybdis and Scylla on either side, and trying to just to make sure that the rules-based order is protected in this way. As a template, you're right. I mean, Japan has got phenomenal public debt. I think 260% of GDP. So even though it's sustainable, clearly there are limits to what they can spend. But I think one of the interesting things that Japan has done is use institutional reform to try to deal with the issues that have cropped up. So as Yuka said, the National Security Secretariat, NSS, they set up an economics division in 2020. Over the last couple of years, its sort of bandwidth has been sucked up by COVID. But you can see there that they're trying to sort of take account in policy formation of the overlap between economics and geopolitics. So I think you don't have to spend lots of money on doing this, but I think you have to sort of reconceptualize institutions to try and make sure that you have a sort of whole of government approach to geoeconomics or increasingly now to economic security.
I'll just add, first of all, on NATO standards, I just want to interpret it on that one of the purposes for highlighting that is also to make the amount of increase less than it otherwise would need to be, because it's popularly believed that Japan has a limit of 1% of GDP on spending. Actually, if you the point that's made is that if you measure on NATO standards, it's 1.25, their current spending, all because of things like pensions and so forth, but also the Coast Guard and other things. So the gap between 1.25 and 2 is less, so it was also a minimizing thing. Second observation, I think on James Landau's question, I think Japan has always felt relatively uncomfortable at the democracy-autocracy division. One previous incarnation of this sort of slogan about free and open Indo-Pacific was one called Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, which sought to identify democracy as part of it, but that was pretty firmly dropped by Abe Shinzo and the team around him, partly because of the area that Japan is in. If you divide up on a democracy autocracy ground, you don't have a lot of friends in Southeast Asia. So so that's one. Second, Russia was the key thing, and of course a key part of Abe Shinzo's policy was seeking to resolve historic issues with Russia over the Northern Islands, but also get close to Russia to pull it a bit away from China. That all failed, and in some ways the invasion of Ukraine and so forth has clarified matters, if you like, from a point of view of Japanese policy, which under the Kishida administration has been much more clearly aligned with the rest of the West than on almost any other international crisis that you can imagine. Usually Japanese policy has not been to join sanctions, has been to keep its head down. Now it's much more aligned. If it has as it were, a Western framework, it's more about the rules-based order than it is about democracy versus autocracy. Final quick answer on Dana and what's left from the Japan bashing of the 1980s and the bludgeoning of Toshiba electronic equipment on the Capitol Hill. One lesson from that period is don't project into the future foolishly. I mean, there was a sort of a folly about all of that. But part of the legacy is that some of that sense of Japan as an economic rival really strongly is there in economic policy. Why did Abe Shinzo get on a plane in a protocol-busting way to meet Donald Trump in New York in November 2016, just after his election? Yes, it's about security, but it was also about economics and about not wanting to have the protectionist president attack Japan in the way that he was clearly going to attack other allies. In the end, he did attack Japan, steel and aluminium tariffs on Japan, but didn't attack the car industry, didn't do some other things. So maybe there was a damage mitigation, a limitation purpose there. So I guess I'm saying that you and I aren't as young as we used to be, but actually some of this is still going on. So our memory is useful, Dana.
Useful co-endorsement. You can.
Sure, maybe several quick comments for me. I completely, I think, agree with Bill's comments about Japan's approach to democracy versus autocracy. Japan really, and if you look at the Shangri-La speech as well, Prime Minister Kishida really emphasizes that this is a challenge, unilateral challenge to the status quo or the rules-based order, which is also an important narrative that I think when not Japan aligning with the West interest, but the West also interest aligning with in the Indo-Pacific, is trying to play a bridging role to share how Japan thinks, what kind of narratives that the European countries maybe need to think about that will resonate to the countries in the region as a stable actor in the region. And then in terms of more specific areas of interest alignments within Europe, for instance, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida attended a NATO summit for the first time as a Japanese leader. There's a lot of interests aligned, not just the challenge to the rules-based order, but in the core security challenges like cyber and space. This is not geographical anymore. And as countries, as US and Japan, for instance, enhance its interoperability, attacks on Japanese assets could be something that would happen in the case of even a Russian operation. So these are all the things that Japan's, the security challenges in the new era is also kind of driving factors for Japan's closer cooperation, and some of the capabilities that Japan also has to contribute, especially in the space realm. And then the final point about template. I think I agree with Robert's point about changing the institutions in a way that would better function. And we've already, I think, seen in several European countries that are kind of taking a similar path of trying to put economic security policy or economic security division within a more kind of higher level, not just in one of the ministries, but also in the cabinet level, even in the United Kingdom. But also just more generally, I think the free and open Indo-Pacific itself, it's not even a strategy, it's just like a vision that, it was a one sheet of slide deck that Japan started promoting, and now, all these countries, like-minded partners, are using the word Indo-Pacific and using the phrases free and open Indo-Pacific, and it's quite fascinating to see how that kind of, Japan was able to mobilize that kind of thinking without putting a lot of actual budget and funding behind it before it actually became a concrete vision. So I think those are the things that other countries can maybe learn from Japan. Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, then final word for the panel, ending at about 12:32. One thing for all 3 of you to mark down is a question I've received online, which is a question about how important it is for Japan to forge a strong geo-economic relationship with India. We remember that the Indo-Pacific phrase was one that Abe Shinzo in his first administration discussed with Prime Minister Modi before he was Prime Minister and was ruling Gujarat. First question from Chung-Min Lee of Korea, who will no doubt implicitly or explicitly ask about Japanese-Korean relations.
No, I won't.
Well, but I'll ask the panel anyway to make a comment as to how they think about Japan-Korea relations.
Well,
Go
first
ahead.
of all, congratulations to both authors for writing a really timely book. My question to Yuka first. You mentioned the Japanese academics or academic institutions really do not want to go into dual-use technology innovation because for security, I guess, constraints. If that's the case, who will fill the gap? Will it be Japanese corporations? Because that, I think, is critical if Japan wants to have a leading edge on emerging technologies with both military and civilian, I guess, repercussions. My second question to you, Yuka, is on the policy front. Do you believe that the LDP really has the ability to have a comprehensive security posture, including technologies going forward? In other words, do they have the recourse to be, I guess, deeply involved with the Ministry of Defense, with the self-defense forces, with outside technology interests and so forth, so that they will have a robust policy? My question to you, Robert, is quite simple. Looking in the next, I guess, 4 or 5 year time frame, if there is another Trump trauma, should he come back to the White House, or someone like him re-enters the Oval Office, how much does Japan's impact on or experience on geoeconomics serve as a buffer to political tensions or political traumas, as the case may be? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chung-Min. And in the front row, John Scarlett, please, and then we'll come back to the panel. John.
Right. Thank you very much, John Scarlett. You mentioned Russia, and Bill, you mentioned the relationship with Russia, and Robert, you mentioned Russia. And you're presenting that as now having changed, and Kishida's position being quite so clear. I think all the same, it's just worth asking a question, having in previous years, until quite recently, been engaged in many conversations with Japanese colleagues about this, trying to explain the reality of dealing with Russia and with Putin. Remember all those visits they had to each other. And in particular, the reality over taking back territory from Russia. And I just wasn't making progress in the discussion. And there seems a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian thinking and Russian policy amongst very sophisticated analysts. And I'm just wondering what that's telling us now. Can it just be changed quite quickly because you've got a different prime minister? Or is it telling us something deeper about the view of the world outside, the capability of getting into the brains of a culture which is really quite different? I'm just trying to understand the deeper meaning of it. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. So I'll go in, as it were, reverse order from before. Yuka first, then Bill, and Robert can have the closing last word. Yuka.
Sure. Maybe I'll focus on the question by Chung-Min Lee. So I think the first question was who is going to fill in a gap. I think just looking at the data, it seems like as the academic institutions' participation declined in these basic research fund, seems like the portion of the industry is increasing, which I think is a good sign that, and I think the trend of anti-militarism within the industries are starting to shift. But we also still see the prime defense contractors not necessarily very much open about their defense work, which still shows the challenges in this debate. And it's not just anti-militarism, but I think it's the way the defense industry structures and opportunities, the fewer opportunities that they these industries see. But at the same time, I think what's interesting, just looking at the Japanese tech industry right now, is that non-military, non-traditional military defense firms are also showing interest in taking part in defense, especially when other countries, other governments approach them in their interest in technology capability for military purposes, and that kind of give opportunities for new kind of startups to be engaged in these defense industries. And then a point on LDP, and I think the fact that Prime Minister Kishida made a very strong statement at Shangri-La, but also at the recent NATO summit, that he's going to secure a substantial amount of budget, is a very important signal that we haven't really seen in Japanese government debate, a very commitment to boost its capabilities. I think and we also see that a lot of the politicians and the policy makers are also traveling to U.S. to learn about future warfighting, for instance, or how to prepare contingencies. But I think when it comes to actually integrating emerging technologies for military capabilities, I think Japan has a lot to learn. It has a lot to learn from how other military powers like the United States are adopting it, and it seems like one of the major challenges to do that is actually the information security challenges that Japan has in its government, but also in industry. So those are like technical challenges, but I think the will is there. Thank you.
Brilliant, Luca. Thank you. Bill.
So we start with the Trump trauma question, and then I'll go on to the Russia trauma question. I think a reasonable way to describe the shape of policy that Yuka and Robert have analyzed, and also that we've seen over longer than just the last 10 years, but is that, Japan knows that it cannot achieve, to use President Macron's phrase, strategic autonomy in Asia. But what it's built is a sense of strategic agency, the ability to influence through its own diplomatic relationships, through the institutions that it's built, through the various different minilaterals and other entities, and, of course, by building up now, in the past and in the future, its own military and security capabilities in order to be more important also to the friends in Washington. So agency, I think, is really what they seek to build and achieve. And of course, I think in Tokyo, as you know very well, better than I do, I'm sure, absolute terror at the thought of, as it were, of how a rogue Washington might develop and where it might go. Actually, recently, most terror at the thought that America might not defend Taiwan in the case of intimidation or invasion, rather than, as it were, the opposite sort of rogueness, but nevertheless an absolute strong consciousness of that. I think what's most important about Japan in the whole region is, compared with the United States, is that Japan is present in the region on all of these dimensions that Robert and Yuka have analyzed, whereas the US is present on the defense and security dimension, but not on all sorts of other things. Japan kind of substitutes for that in all sorts of ways. So that's that. On Russia, I think it is genuinely hard to understand, and there's a danger I find in thinking about it that I, as it were, impose my own kind of rationality on the relationship without necessarily any evidence for it. But when one looks back at this long policy towards Russia, one can see three interests overlapping, one of which was the Northern Islands, the Northern Territories issue, which all seemed to me to be a delusional, but useful for political purposes, domestically, not internationally, domestically.
It was emotional.
Emotional, exactly, but also a kind of, a sort of a motivator for some people. But the other two were very powerful. One was the view that you could somehow hedge Russia against China by building an economic, particularly energy relationship with Russia, and, as it were, act as a third pole a little bit, rather as James was saying, I think helped to overcome some of the delusional aspects, as it were, of that politics. And then thirdly, a strong business interest that lay behind that also pushed for it. getting, with the benefit, of course, of a lot of public financing through JBIC and others, but you've got basically a combined business lobby to continue this beyond, in some ways, the sense of kind of strategic rationality. So yes, I think that there was a blinkered approach, a lack of understanding, but a certain amount of wishful thinking driving it, but also you had those other interests that sort of, I think, kept on justifying it, even beyond it being credible. So has it now changed? Well, I think Russia is definitively not separable from China on the basis of Japanese policy. That has changed the situation. Is there still a business link and a particular part of a goal towards energy, also satisfying energy diversity of supply through maintaining Sakhalin? The answer is yes, that hasn't changed completely. So that dilemma between the business interest but also an energy supply interest and the political reality remains.
Bill, thank you very much. So last word from Robert Ward, and you have to tackle the Indo-Japanese question then. Go ahead.
So on Trump, I mean, Abe was a superlative Trump whisperer. I mean, second to none in the G7, I think. Absolutely astonishing how he just did so well with Trump. And actually, in my view, he used the Trump's administration, the period, to actually craft his own China policy as well and just recalibrate things in Japan. So, I mean, Abe had quite a lot of agency during the Trump period, I think. And Bill's point about Japan's strategic agency, I think, is absolutely spot on. Japan has paid a lot of attention to coalition building in the region, the sort of groupings, millilaterals, multilaterals, and so on. And part of this is because Japan can't do the things it needs to do in the region on its own. But part of this is also because Japan has this perennial fear about the US sort of losing interest in the region. So I think these coalitions, this effort, will stand Japan in good stead. And keep coming back to the CPTPP, which is not just about trade, it's about geopolitics as well. And having the CPTPP, I think, in the region up and running and really important is in your word, I think is a good word, an important buffer against things going wrong in the US. On Russia, my sense is that many people in Japan are kind of slightly relieved that this policy has been ditched, that actually and repudiated and now no longer likely to return. The rapprochement that Abe was trying to achieve with Russia, it did have certainly, optimistically, as Bill said, a sort of hedging against this sort of Russia-China relationship emerging. It was always, if you look objectively at that idea, it was always over-optimistic given Russia's view about where Japan sits with the US. I thought it was always not entirely realistic. But that policy now has been completely discredited and repudiated, and it's striking how quickly that happened, particularly given Japan's reaction to the 2014 annexation of Crimea and so on. But if you look at the way that the Japanese government is now describing the disputed Northern Territories, talking about it as inherent territory of Japan rather than the territory over which Japan has sovereignty that the Abe administration used. So the outlook for Japan-Russia relations, I think, is quite poor. And one of the things I'm looking at specifically is the Sakhalin-2 investment that they've got. I don't think actually over the longer term that is viable, given all the other things that are going on. But I think, as Bill said, Japan has energy security issues and frailty that make a sort of quick decision there rather more difficult.
One sentence on Indo-Japan. India and Japan.
So one sentence with lots of sub-clauses in it. A very important relationship, fulcrum of the free and open Indo-Pacific, huge advances in Indo-Japanese relations under Abe. The Quad, for example, clearly India, very important for Japan there. Japan sees India as sort of natural ally in terms of being a democracy, a fast-growing economy, but clearly India has a sort of quite a nuanced view of the world that doesn't always square with what Japan hopes will be the case.
Thank you very much. So we're very lucky at the IISS. We have Yuka Koshino, Bill Emmett, Robert Wood, Mariko Togashi, and others who are focused on understanding and interpreting Japan, its geoeconomic, geostrategic, and as Chu Min Lee would like to say, geotechnological interests globally. Join me in thanking our three panelists today for helping us launch the Japan Show.